Hi, everyone. As you hopefully are aware, I am not Kendra Seaman, right? Kendra is actually hosting and running a SR and DNA conference in Boston. So she's asked me to introduce today's speaker. Now, I could, rather than you hearing me talk at length about Mick and then hearing computer science, I'm going to try to give him more of the floor time. And in keeping with that, Kendra's written out the introduction, so it makes my job much easier. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Science Luncheon at the Center for Vital Longevity. It is my honor to introduce our speaker today, our very own Dr. Mick Rugg. Mick is a renowned cognitive neuroscientist whose work has significantly advanced our understanding of memory and aging. Dr. Rugg is professor of behavioral and brain sciences at the University of Texas at Dallas and a distinguished chair in neuroscience. Okay. He also serves as the director of the Center for Vital Longevity, where he leads a vibrant research program focused on the neuromechanisms of memory and how these processes change across the lifespan. With a career spanning decades and continents, Dr. Rugg has authored over 300 scientific publications and is widely recognized for his pioneering use of neuroimaging techniques, particularly both EEG and fMRI, for how the brain encodes and retrieves memories. His work has deepened our theoretical understanding of younger and older populations of adults. Today, Dr. Rugg will share insights from his latest research, offering us a window into how memory functions in the aging brain and what it means for the future of cognitive neuroscience. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rugg.
Very much, I'm not actually going to be saying anything about aging today at all. So what I'm going to be talking about today is something that I and a colleague have been working on for a little while. And this is the concept of representation, particularly as it's applied to memory, and specifically as it's applied to episodic memory. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, when I talk about episodic memory, I'm talking about memory for unique events, single-shot memory. Episodic memory would be what allowed you to remember what you had for breakfast this morning rather than yesterday, where you parked your car, or what it was that you meant to do before you came to this talk. I'm now thinking about. So this is relatively narrow. We're going to be talking about this particular kind of memory. And episodic memory is particularly interesting because it's been associated with this concept of mental time travel, the idea that episodic memory carries with it this ability to know that you're in the present, but at the same time have a mental representation of the past. And that's essentially what I'm going to be talking about today. Some of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about developed from discussions with this group of authors. We got together to publish this paper in TICS a few years ago, and then more recently, a paper that's I think is just about in press, Cognitive Neuroscience and Memory Representations. You'll see that what's in common to these two papers is the same name, Renaud, who's my long-standing collaborator, particularly with respect to trying to figure out how we integrate theoretical and philosophical ideas about memory with our empirical studies. So what I'm going to try to do today is go through a few topics to hopefully have some coherence. I'm going to talk about types of memory representation, and in fact, not just types of memory representation, but types of mental representations. I'm going to ask, is episodic memory just a special case of imagination? This is particularly relevant if you, no reason why you should have done, if you have been reading recent philosophy of memory papers. This has become almost an obsession for philosophers. I'm going to argue that the engram, or the memory trace, whatever you call it, is a causal link between an online experience and memory. And I'm going to argue that the existence of an engram is what makes the difference between imagining an episode and truly remembering an episode. I'm going to talk about neural reinstatement as a defining feature of episodic memory retrieval. And then I'm going to talk about memory updating. So why should we care about representations? Most people in this room, if you've written a paper on memory, you will have used the word representation, guarantee it. But you will not necessarily have known what it is that you're talking about. And I speak from personal experience. This is a very confused sentence from a review paper from a little while ago. I will just pre-retrieval processes responsible. This is just excerpted someone talking about memory retrieval. Pre-retrieval processes responsible for generating a representation of a retrieval queue that maximizes overlap with the stored memory representation. Retrieval processes that occur when a queue representation overlaps sufficiently with a stored memory representation to cause pattern confusion, and reinstatements of the representation in the cortex. So there's how many different meanings of the word representation in there? The confused idiot who wrote that sentence. So I don't consider myself to be that confused, but just an example. I thought it was best to, I could point to many other people's examples, but this is sufficiently egregious for our purposes. There's no definition of representation. There's no way of knowing what it is that is being talked about, but it's clear there's more than one thing being talked about by the same name. So this is what motivated Louis and I to sit down and think about how we might try to have a taxonomy of this term representation, the different ways in which it can be used. And at the same time, both of us were reading some of the recent philosophical work on representations in general and memory representations in particular. This is what motivated us to think about this. So what is it that we're talking about when we talk about memory representations? In this case, we're going to be specifically concerned with episodic memory representations, but some of this generalizes much of this. So what is a memory representation? The most general definition one might come up with is that memory representations are information-bearing entities that represent mnemonic content in a manner that allows that content to influence cognition and behavior. So the idea is that a representation, some entity in the brain, which in a sense provides or supplies information about the past, mnemonic information, and it does so in a way that allows for the control of behavior and perhaps the alteration of a cognitive state. So that's a very general definition. We subdivided or divide representations into two fundamental categories. The first of these are what we would call active representations. And an active representation is a memory representation which is in a form that means right now this memory representation is guiding your behavior or potentially guiding your behavior and potentially generating a mental representation of a past event. And then within active representations, we have two different kinds here, so-called cognitive or mental memory representation. And this cognitive representation is representing information about a past event in a manner that can be attended, reported on, and employed to guide goal-directed. Another way of thinking about this is that this is a conscious mental representation. There is something it is like to have a cognitive memory representation. When Endel Tulving, for example, talks about a retrieved episodic memory, he is referring to a representation at the cognitive level, which is associated with a specific phenomenology. And in his case, that phenomenology includes this sense of traveling back in time, so-called mental time travel. A lot of the time when people use the term memory representation, I think this is what they're referring to. So given that this is episodic memory, then all sorts of phenomenology is associated with this. But crucially, there is some kind of conscious awareness of the fact that I'm entertaining, holding a mental representation. We can distinguish that from a neural memory representation. When we talk about a neural representation, we are referring to a neural ensemble that demonstrates a pattern of activity that correlates at least partially with the pattern that was elicited by the neural representation of a past event. And a neural memory representation is necessary for a memory of the event to influence ongoing cognition and behavior. Now, we're not implying some kind of dualism. There is no doubt so-called cognitive memory representation as a neural substrate. But we want to make this distinction because not every neural memory representation has a corresponding cognitive representation. Think of implicit memory. There are many forms of memory retrieval which are outside conscious access. They're not accessible to consciousness. They're still driving our behavior, and we can still pick those up. We can do appropriate brain recordings. We can show that people are retrieving an implicit memory, even though they're not aware of the fact they are doing so. So it's an important distinction to make. And we should bear in mind that when we are doing neuroimaging experiments, we are only ever looking at the neural correlates for cognitive memory representation. And we don't know the degree to which those neural correlates are an amalgam of the neural memory representation that was originally set up when you encoded it, and additional stuff that's never coming. The other major distinction, the other class of memory representations that we want to make a rigid distinction from active representations are what are called latent representations. This is where things get really confusing by people in the memory field. This gets conflated all the time. So if I say to you, what is a memory representation? You're as likely, or you personally, but people are as likely to define that in these terms as they are in these terms, without necessarily even realizing that these are two different things. So for us, a latent memory representation, and one can also think of this as a memory trace. We like the term trace, or engram. The term engram has become extremely popular with people looking at the neurobiology of memory at the single neuron level in transgenic mice. There's now a cottage industry in identifying engram ensembles at the level of single neuron, labeled single neurons in experimental mice. A latent memory representation is a change in the brain that encodes information about an experience in a manner that allows some of that information to later be reactivated and to contribute to the content of an active memory representation. This is not a new idea. Richard Semon, this idea in his book, D-Me, in 1904. He defined a latent memory representation, as we now call it, the enduring, though primarily latent modifications in the irritable substance produced by stimulus. We need to reintroduce the term irritable substance to cognitive science. I think we're missing something there. But the basic idea is that a latent memory representation is a physical change in the brain. It doesn't matter what it is. Right now, people think that the most likely substrate of latent memory representations are modifications of synaptic strength in ensemble neurons. But it can be anything. It could be a modification of RNA. It doesn't matter. But it's something that has been induced to be a physical change in the brain as a function of an experience that is encoding that experience. It's encoding it, but unless it is activated, it has no behavioral significance, no behavioral relevance. The problem with the excerpt from my chapter that I showed you was that there's a conflation between latent memory representations and active memory representations. see this all the time. And often people use the word representation without telling what kind of representation they're referring to. And I think it's a hugely important distinction. It's one that is well recognized in this mouse literature. Sheila Jocelyn and Paul Franklin, say it again. Thank you. Have made a big deal of this, but I don't think this has permeated cognitive science very much. So, a few other things to say. The content of an active memory representation need not be determined exclusively by the information encoded in the memory trace. That may sound contradiction in terms, but it's not. A memory representation can contain information that was encoded in the memory trace, but it could also contain additional information as well. We know that memory retrieval is often highly constructed. And we know that when we retrieve information about an event, we get some specific information about that event, but not everything that comes back. We can make use of schematic information, semantic information to fill in the missing bits and to end up with a representation of a prior event that is supported by or scaffolded by schematic information. So, for example, remembering, say, I don't know, a friend's birthday party 6 months ago, you may well have an engram that encodes information about that birthday party, but it probably doesn't tell you everything about it. But because we have so much schematic and semantic knowledge about birthday parties, you don't need to remember every detail of the birthday party to be able to come up with a very plausible description of what happened. You know there's going to be a cake. You know people are going to sing happy birthday, etc. And so the actual active memory representation is going to be an amalgam of specific information encoded in the trace, then a whole bunch of non-specific information that adds to that. Yeah, no.
Just a question, and I think I'll have to ask questions as you go along.
Of course,
so we don't remember.
I should have said that. Please do. Please interrupt. No. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So here my thought goes to, like, if you, is it a measure? Is it a problem of what you define as it encompass? It could be that the schema becomes also part of it, activated to some extent, and you say, this is all it. So it would be, there's a way probably to equate the content of an active memory representation. Need not be determined exclusively by information encoded in the memory. It could be.
Absolutely
depending on
there's no question. No, absolutely.
The phenomena that you describe, right?
I totally agree. And in fact, in the traditional list learning experiments that we know and love, it is very likely that the active memory representation is entirely determined by the activation of the memory trace. There is, remembering that I saw this pair of words rather than that pair of words 20 minutes ago, there's no schematic information that you need, nothing that you help. So this is a continuum. We'll talk about this more as we go along, but absolutely. And the final thing just to say is that we want to argue strongly that irrespective of any accompanying phenomenology, representations of veridical and non-veridical memories are distinguished by the fact that veridical representations are causally linked to a past event by a memory trace. So for us, this is a very strong statement. And when I gave a version of this talk in the summer at an experimental philosophy conference, the room exploded at this point, because this is anathema to people who want to argue that memory trace, physical memory trace, has nothing to do with how you define a memory. But we want to argue very strongly, yes, it does. And for a memory to be a memory, it must have, this is our argument, only ours, actually, we stole it from philosophy. It must have a causal link to a past event. If it's not causally linked to a past event, it's not a memory. That's our argument we're sticking to. So, just on that basis, as many people in this room will know, one of the arguments that's been put forward for the idea that imagination, or I'll call it imagination, covers a whole bunch of things, imagining what's going to happen in the future, etc., and memory and episodic memory are essentially the same thing. The argument's being made on the basis of the fact that trying to imagine something, for example, that's going to happen in the future, or trying to imagine something fantastical, like walking on the moon, seems to activate the same memory network as episodic or autobiographical memory retrieval. So this is a couple of papers from Dan Schachter's group showing, here, this is a nice little cartoon, showing that when people retrieve memories, autobiographical memories, and when they project themselves into the future, when they imagine a future, some kind of future event, you get co-activation. It's also shown here. You get co-activation of a very characteristic brain network, which Dan has referred to as the core network. And this argument has been taken up particularly by Donna Rosales, but also by many philosophers now, as strong evidence, empirical evidence, for the fact that to have an episodic memory is simply guided imagination. It's simply simulating a past event. Whether or not that past event actually happened or not is not relevant to the definition of a memory representation. It's the phenomenology that determines the memory representation, not whether or not that memory representation is causally linked to a past event. So that's what I've just said here. It's worth noting that if instead of doing autobiographical or episodic future thought experiments, you just have people lie in a scanner and try to recollect words off a word list, you see activation of the exact same brain, which we called the core recollection network. Everyone has to have a network that has a name. It's very interesting. This is the default mode of work, or at least a lateralized version of it. This is the core network, and this is also the core recollection network. As you'll see, it's also another network as well, which I think is very important. Here's our core recollection network. Looks beautiful. We have a lovely story about why this network is so important for episodic memory. Here is the semantic network, as defined by Jeff Binder. It's exactly the same. So what this is showing is the outcome of a meta-analysis in which the only thing that people are doing is either a relatively low-level semantic task, like reading a word, as opposed to reading a non-word, things like this. And they have a whole bunch of different semantics. Crucial point is that even when people are not engaged in any kind of imagination, any kind of episodic memory, any kind of mental time travel, you see activation of the exact same memory. Just to make this point, emphasize this point, these are two sets of data from our own lab, where we went back and looked at contrasting here animacy versus odd even syllable judgments, and here judging word pairs, their semantic versus their similarity. And you can see you don't need to have people remembering anything. You can just be doing an online semantic judgment, activate exactly the same brain network. Consequentially, we think it is likely that the overlap between the neural correlates of episodic remembering and episodic future thought, they seem as likely to reflect a common engagement of semantic and conceptual processing as anything more profound, like simulation, mental time travel, whatever. We think, and I say this with personal pain, that the core recollection network is nothing more than the fact that when you retrieve episodic information, there is a huge amount of conceptual and semantic processing that's associated with that. We encode the world in terms of its meaning. We retrieve the world in terms of its meaning. But you can strip all of that away, just have people make anonymous decisions versus chronological decisions, and you see the same thing. So we think that that is unlikely to be very solid evidence for parallel between these processes.
Yeah. So I agree with the idea that, if anything, much of this overlap probably points to some shared components underlying set of things. To what extent, though, do you think, and have you looked closely at some of there? We could see posterior components on the lateral surface and the medial surface.
Okay.
But there are distinctions, right? Like, looking at supramarginal gyrus versus angular gyrus versus semantic versus episodic perspective.
If you look, well, not really, no.
So, like, I can see in the semantic versus the angular gyrus in the episodic.
You can look at any given. If you look here, this is the angular gyrus. In fact, Jeff Binder has an entire theory about why the angular gyrus is so sensitive to semantic cognition. So the angular gyrus is seen as a crucial semantic hub. It's not the supramarginal, it's the angular gyrus. By the same token, the medial prefrontal cortex is also seen as having a crucial role in semantic and conceptual representation.
Sure, but for both those structures, there's dorsal and ventral divisions.
There are, but when you look across different experiments within any one of these traditions, you find that the patterns vary quite considerably. So within our own lab, the call recollection network, in some of our studies, we find activation that's around here, roughly, midway along the end of the medial prefrontal. Others, it's down here. Sometimes it's the whole thing. No one has ever come up with an explanation why these things move around. Principle. And the same is true if you look at episodic future thought. The same is true if you look at semantic cognition.
So do you view those as? Do you think there's an absence of heterogeneity in functional profiles, or do you think there's something there?
No, I think a lot of this is thresholding. It's unknown task factors that we simply don't know how to control. But remember, all of these, what you see here depends a lot on how you threshold it. I can make these activations big or small, depending on the threshold I'm applying. Don't pay too much attention to that, simply because it's unexplained variance. I don't know that it's systematic. So, talking about causal approaches, we actually take the view that if there's anything that distinguishes between a memory and other kinds of mental representations, is this notion of a causal link. This idea has been in philosophy forever. I think David Hume, I think Plato. There's nothing new about it. It was resurrected in its modern form by Martin and Deutsche in 1966. And this is a little cartoon that kind of explains the way they were thinking about causal theories of memory. You perceive an event, the perception is translated into a memory trace or an engram. That is a latent memory representation that hangs around in the brain. Given an appropriate retrieval cue, trace is activated, a presto memory comes. So the basic idea is one of a simple causal link. A more updated version of that, which is more consistent with what we know about memory and the cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology of memory, is that when we experience an event, what gets encoded into the memory trace is a record of how we process that event. So the same event can give rise to very different kinds of memory, depending on how we process that event. And there is just so much evidence in favor of this, both cognitive psychology and from neuroimaging. So depending on, for example, if I ask you to encode a word in terms of its semantics, as opposed to encode a word in terms of phonological characteristics, the memory representation will be complete. And in fact, the retrieval cue that is most likely to bring that memory back will be complete. So the idea is that a memory trace, if you want to call it that, is encoding a record of the processing that was elicited by. Same thing happens here. A retrieval cue activates the trace. But crucially now, a retrieval queue can also activate other kinds of information like schematic information. And the retrieved memory can itself feed back to elicit additional information like semantic information, so that the retrieved memory still has a causal link to a past event, but it can contain, as I said before, information that goes above and beyond what was encoded in that memory trace. And that's the basic idea. Yeah.
So you're making memory different than a trace. And
Totally. Absolutely.
And so, you know, if you look there, there'll be the trace is the latent.
Trace encodes information about an experienced event. A memory representation can go above and beyond the information that was encoded in the memory trace. That's the basic idea, and that's the constructive part of memory. It doesn't have to, but it can be.
Yeah, it's just I feel like by putting those as two different things, also like with arrows specifically indicating one to the other, like it just leaves me thinking, could memory just be the trace?
No, that's exactly the point. No, it is not. If the trace is not a memory, the trace is just a physical change in the brain. Unless it's activated, it becomes an active memory representation. It's not a memory at all. It's a latent memory or a potential memory. So that's the whole point of the distinction between an active memory representation, this thing, and a latent memory representation, this thing. That's the idea. So depending on the experiment and the circumstance, as I said before, an active memory representation may only contain the information that was encoded in the trace, but it can go well beyond. The birthday party examples I was referring. So that's the basic idea, and then that can get extended. And this is an idea that's been, yes, sure, please.
I did want to ask a question bouncing off of that. Would you then say that a memory has to be recalled or retrieved in order for it to be classified as a memory if the trace never gets queued?
That's a really great question. Great question. How would you ever know the trace was there?
Exactly.
So I think that's a super interesting question, and I don't have a clear answer to it. You could argue that the memory trace itself gives you the potential for a memory. I am going to argue that to remember something is to turn a trace into an active memory representation. If you don't do that, you're not remembering.
Yeah.
But you don't necessarily have to remember consciously. So that's what implicit memory is.
Yes. Okay.
But the argument would be you can't have a memory, a veridical memory, without a memory trace. But you can have a memory trace without a memory. If there is no cue that activates that trace, the trace might as well not be there.
Well, presumably that trace can contribute to other memories though, right?
No, because it has to get activated.
So activated towards another memory.
Yes, but that would require a cue that activated the trace. So I agree with what you're saying, but you still have to turn it from a latent to an active representation. That representation might be only real, but it has to, as long as it just stays latent, it will have no behavioral significance. So thank you. It's a very good question. It's been much debated, actually. So, yeah.
Considering how the semantic and episodic networks overlap, is it possible? I know we think of semantic memory usually as something that we've learned and we don't know how to learn it. But what if it's more when we recall it, especially because semantic representations that are included in experiments are generally nouns? What if people are actually thinking of, say, an experience where they had some sort of,
Well, that case, it's not a semantic memory by definition.
for example, the same kind of thing with semantic words that are
So-
articles
Yeah.
or
Sure,
that are not necessarily concrete.
sure.
Or if we use a language that is not necessarily the one that the person is.
So semantic memory goes way beyond language. When I use the term semantic memory, I'm not referring only to language at all. You need your semantic memory to know that you're looking at a picture of a horse rather than a picture of a dog. You don't need to know the names of those two animals to
Right.
appreciate the conceptual distinction between them. But your point is the overlap between semantic and episodic memory. I don't think there is one. We don't know.
think that
We don't.
people are necessarily.
My argument is you can't.
But
My argument is that overlap is not a good guide to whether or not fundamental cognitive operations are shared or not.
so you do
If
not,
you need conceptual information, then you're always going to see conceptual information. Yeah.
I guess the reason I asked that is because in the animacy question, and that particular
Yeah.
contrast, with animacy, don't you have to be able to think about a time that you saw that particular animal?
No.
Or
Not
that,
at all. Not if it's a semantic judgment. By definition, you do not. Semantic memory, by definition, is decontextualized. So you know what Paris, what the capital of France is, without having to remember the last time you went there. That's called semantic memory. And that is what makes it semantic. If you have to refer back to a specific episode to remember, it's an episodic memory, it's not a semantic memory. That's the classical distinction. Not saying that's right, but that's the classical distinction. Need to move on. So just to finish up this little bit, having established the notion of the memory trace as being a cause of a veridical memory, we can extend this to the notion of a causal chain. And again, this is no way is this an original idea. This is Lynn Nadell and Morris Moscovitch had a very, very similar idea many years ago. They called it multiple trace theory. The idea is every time that you retrieve a memory, that memory can be re-encoded as a new memory. And so you can end up with multiple representations of the same event. That's been looked at in all sorts of ways subsequently, but the basic idea is that you could end up with a causal chain so that when I come, let's say, to retrieve information about this event, if I'm relying on this memory representation, there is a gap, if you like, which is mediated by multiple traces between the original event and my memory of it now. And the idea is that re-encoding gives us the potential for memory modification. Now, I'm going to argue that actually there's very weak evidence for memory modification, if I ever get to that part of the talk, but that there is very little. The evidence for memory modification that's been put forward is weak. But more to the point, we end up with a disparity between the age of an engram and the age of what it represents. So this engram here is representing something that happened. So there is no necessary simultaneity between the formation of a memory trace and the event that that memory trace is encoding. Because of this possibility of a causal chain, I could have a memory engram that was formed yesterday, but which is actually encoding information about an event that occurred 20 years ago. Bertrand Russell made a huge fuss about this in his discussions about memory. He argued that it was a fundamental fallacy to think that when you retrieve a memory 20 years ago, you have to be somehow activating something that was formed in the mind, didn't have the brain 20 years ago. There's no necessary relationship between the two. So I think that's an interesting implication of this notion of re-encoding. In terms of neural reinstatement, many people in this room will know what we're referring to here. Neural reinstatement is the reinstatement of a patterning of neural activity that was elicited as an event was experienced. Reinstatement is held to be necessary, it's held by us, I should say, to be necessary for veridical mnemonic content. I'll explain why in a moment. So we want to argue that patterns of reinstated neural activity meet the definition of a neural representation. And we want to argue very strongly that the presence versus the absence of reinstatement could be a neural marker of veridical versus non-veridical memory, regardless of any accompanying phenomenology. In other words, regardless, if you have a false memory, but it feels to you like a real memory, which by definition it must do, as we would call it false memory. If you look in the brain, you'll find that that false memory is not associated with the reinstatement of activity that occurred at the time that an event occurred, because you're remembering an event that never happened. The event never happened. There can't be a pattern of activity that was elicited by that event. So the presence versus the absence of reinstatement is diagnostic. This is the argument of veridical versus non-veridical memories. I'm going to skip this, other than to make one little point. This is from Sheena Jocelyn and Paul Franklin's review some time ago. People looking in the mouse literature, so-called engrams, are looking at labeled single neuron. People doing fMRI experiments looking at reinstatement are looking at activity in fMRI voxels. And the best estimate from the Allen Institute is that a 2 millimeter isotropic MRI voxel contains 120,000 neurons. Just want to make the point that the spatial scale is just a little different, tiny, just a little bit. So, we can identify neural reinstatement, memory reinstatement with fMRI in a variety of ways. The original way, and perhaps the most simplest way, is simply to look at patterns of activity that are elicited when people are encoding, in this case, an auditory or a visual event, and the patterns of activity that are elicited when they're retrieving those events later. And when you do that, you find that when people are retrieving auditory information, you get overlap of activity with where auditory information was activating the auditory cortex, or in this case, the superior temporal sulcus, at the time of encoding. And the same thing can happen visually. In other words, you get overlap between activity at encoding, activity at retrieving. We can also use multivoxel methods to derive the same kind of information. I can train a classifier, machine learning classifier, to distinguish between different encoding events. Then I can apply that classifier to retrieval. If the classifier can tell me what's whether you're retrieving event A versus event B, if the classifier was only trained on the encoding information, I know there must be overlap between encoding and retrieval. And this is a study that we conducted a long time ago now that showed that absolutely classifiers are well above chance telling you whether you're remembering one of 3 different events. Actually, yeah, one of 3 different events here. Simply so that there must be encoding retrieval. And we can also do this using a rather simpler technique, simply looking at the correlational approach, where we ask whether the retrieval of the same kind of information, in this case object information versus scene information, gives rise to more similar patterns between encoding and retrieval than does the retrieval, say, an object, the encoding of an object and retrieval of the scene. And again, it's easy to show reinstatement effects which go with the accuracy of the memory, both here for scenes and places. So there are multiple ways in which we can use fMRI to index retrieval-related reinstatement. The idea is that this is the kind of problem. It's not, again, this idea has been around since David Marr, 1969. It probably, in fact, versions of it were actually put forward by Semen and by William James in the early 20th century. The idea is that when we experience an event, set up a pattern of activity in the brain. And in the modern version of this, that pattern of activity is encoded in the hippocampus. So the reason the hippocampus is crucial for episodic memory is that it is listening to the cortex and it is encoding the pattern of activity elicited by the cortex, in the cortex rather, as we experience an event. So the hippocampal engram, so-called, is sitting here in the hippocampus. And what the engram is representing is not a memory or an event. It is representing the pattern of cortical activity that, if active, would represent the event. So it is a second order representation. It's the representation of a representation. If that makes sense. When a retrieval cue comes along, that, if it's sufficiently specific, activates the hippocampal engram, and that gives rise to the reinstatement pattern of activity that was elicited when you experienced the event. So what this means is that to remember something is to essentially reinstate the pattern of activity that elicited when you experienced it. That's what neural reinstatement is. And this has been shown not just in people, but in a variety of non-human animals as well. And the critical role of the hippocampus has been very clearly delineated, particularly in the recent work looking at engram cells in transgenic mice, but also in people. There are some, yes.
So I'm curious, for the discussion of false memories, do you think that there's also some sort of second order representation of a cortical state that is bringing about this false memory?
Yeah.
Or is it being like constructed on the fly?
So that's again, fantastic question. I think that comes down to two different kinds of false memories. So one kind of false memory is not due to a failure of memory retrieval. It's due to a failure of memory monitoring. So I may actually have pattern completion of a memory representation from my hippocampus and reinstatement. But when I monitor the output, I misattribute it. So in other words, there's a misattribution of the cause of the memory, but the memory itself might actually have belonged to an activated engram.
Okay.
I'm misattributing it to the wrong cause.
So it might be like partially degraded from a
Something like that, yeah.
trace.
So a good example would be an intrusion error in free recall. I give you 10-word lists successively to remember. Sometimes you might remember a word off a list that had been given to you previously rather than the current list.
Yes.
It's a veridical memory, but you're misattributing it. The other kind of false memory, which I think is on the fly.
Okay.
I think that is some kind of imagination effect. Don't know how that. So when we look at reinstatement, it's far from complete. This cartoon is inaccurate. In fact, when you do reinstatement experiments with fMRI, you get very incomplete reinstatement of the coding-related activity. And one reason for that is not every feature of the event is encoded. Even if you have a complex event, but what you pay attention to is what gets encoded. And what gets encoded, as I've said before, is a copy of the event. It's a record of how the event was processed. And as I've said also, retrieval often involves an element of filling in. So when you put all of these things together, you do not get a perfect match between encoding and retrieval. It's a partial. There's a lot more going on. I'm going to skip over this other than to say very quickly that one of the issues with all of the stuff I've been talking about is what happens to memories that are so-called consolidated. Everything I've talked about so far is relevant to the hippocampus. But what about so-called cortically consolidated memories? Memories that no longer depend on the hippocampus and are now, if you like, transferred or dependent on the cerebral cortex. The short answer to that is it looks like truly episodic memories never lose their dependence on it. The notion that the hippocampus serves as a temporary repository for episodic memories till they've been consolidated in the cortex, in the neocortex, does not seem to be correct. The kind of memory that's consolidated in the neocortex is a semanticized, schematized, gist-based version of the memory of the event. And as Asaf Gilboa and Morris Moscovich argue, memories that remain detailed and context-specific never lose their dependence on the hippocampus. So the story I'm telling is a story about episodic memories, whether you're retrieving them from 50 years ago, which I can do, but none of you can, or whether you're retrieving them from 5 minutes ago, makes no difference. To the degree that that memory contains high levels of contextual detail and is associated with the phenomenology of mental time travel, your hippocampus is. That's why re-encoding is potentially so important. It's through the vehicle of re-encoding that remote memories are able to retain their episodic flavor. And if they don't, they will be semanticized and gist-based. I haven't got time to go through these, but these are just two examples of recent empirical data strongly supporting this view. Anyone who's interested, you can look the papers up for themselves. The last thing quickly to talk about is memory updating. We've just got time, I think. So memory updating is often taken to mean the modification of an existing memory trace in a manner that changes its content. So people talk about updated memory representations. And this is where the distinction between latent and active representations becomes so important. What I retrieve as an active memory representation may well be different from what I retrieved prior to an experience, but that does not mean that the actual memory traces, the actual engrams themselves, have been updated. That is, that the physical encoding of a memory has been changed. And so there are three classic examples of this, which I will go through incredibly quickly, but we can talk about if anyone has the energy afterwards to do so. The three classic examples are reconsolidation, the famous misinformation effect, memory integration. So reconsolidation refers to the phenomenon whereby when you retrieve a memory, you apparently make that memory vulnerable so that it can be overwritten or it can be modified, or in fact, you make it, if you use a protein synthesis inhibitor, you can actually get rid of the memory. That's the theory, although that is beyond controversy now. But reconsolidation is this notion that when you retrieve a memory, particularly an episodic memory, it becomes vulnerable to modification. The misinformation effect is a little bit similar to that. It relies on a similar mechanism. The classic example of the misinformation effect is that I show you a movie in which a car, for example, stops at a stop sign or fails to stop at a stop sign. And then a little later, I read you a vignette where I either give you a narrative which is consistent with the movie, or, for example, I say, and then the car went straight through the yield sign. Then a bit later, I give you a question. Was the sign that the car drove through a stop sign or a yield sign? And the misinformation effect is that people get confused between stop and yield. A lot of people will say yield rather than stop. And the classic explanation of that is that you've overridden or modified the original memory of a stop sign, replaced it with the memory of a yield sign. That's Elizabeth Loftus's interpretation. That was her interpretation right through until I left UC Irvine. I don't know if it's changed subsequently, but she never deviated. You literally modified the memory. And then memory integration refers to the idea that two memories that may have been separately stored come to be integrated to form a single memory representation. So very quickly, This is going to be super quick. In the case of reconsolidation, there's a bunch of evidence that reconsolidation involves the formation of a new memory trace, not the modification of existing. And in fact, we kind of know this already from the literature on extinction of classically conditioned responses. When you extinguish a classically conditioned response, you're not overwriting the memory with that association. If you wait long enough, you get spontaneous recovery. It's a competition between two. So in this experiment, mice were given contextual fear conditioning. And then they later had their memory of this event retrieved, reminded, either by the original event or by a somewhat different event that was sufficient to re-evoke the original. And if you test their memories in these two cases, you find that if you remind them of the original event, you get much stronger freezing for the original event than for the novel event. But this is the really interesting thing. If I remind you about this event using this somewhat different context, and then I test your memory the next day, you freeze to the new context, not to the original context. So it looks like something's been overwritten. That's what reconsolidation is. That's the concept of reconsolidation. It's a very interesting behavioral thing. The bottom line is that what using triple labeling the relevant neurons, what these investigators show is that in the reminder condition, you re-establish a new memory representation in the hippocampus. You don't strengthen the original one is got rid of, and you establish a new hippocampal memory representation of the original event just by reminding of it. But crucially, if I give you this experience, then you generate, again, a new hippocampal representation. So that at the end of the day, regardless of whether you were reminded about the original event or whether you now are encoding, reconsolidating it, coming up with a new event, you end up with memory representations that do not share neuronal elements with the original memory. So to reconsolidate or even to strengthen the original long-term memory, 21, for a mouse, 21 days is an eternity. The reconsolidation or the strengthening of that memory representation involves the creation of a new hippocampal engram, not the strengthening or the modification of the existing engram. That is dissipated. And in fact, it can be brought back. You can actually show that that engram is still there and under the right conditions can be reactivated. So in other words, it's all new. Memories are not overwriting each other. They're created de novo. In the case of the misinformation effect, I won't go through the neural side. I will just show this beautiful behavioral experiment. This is from 1986. This paper has just, as far as Louis and I can see, this paper's just been. That may tell us that we don't read the right literature. But what these people did was they took the classic misinformation paradigm, where they had people look at a bunch of slides where people were using a hammer. And they then had the misled condition where people saw slides with a hammer. Then they heard a story where the hammer was replaced by a screwdriver. In the classic misinformation paradigm, you are later tested for hammer versus screwdriver. But in this very clever alternative paradigm, they tested for hammer versus wrench. You've never seen wrench before. But if misinformation weakens memory for hammer, then you should be as likely to mix up hammer and wrench here as you are to mix up hammer and screwdriver. You get a big misinformation effect when people have to distinguish between hammer and screwdriver, but that effect goes away when you distinguish between hammer and wrench. In other words, the strength of the memory for the strength of the original memory has not been impacted by the misinformation. What you're setting up is a competing memory. And so the idea is that misinformation is actually a source memory in the future. Just don't remember. And though I'm not going to go through it, exactly the same conclusion comes from looking at neural evidence for memory representations. And the memory for the original event is there. And in fact, it's activated even in trials where you only say memory for the still is not. And then finally, memory integration. This is an experiment in which you see a bunch of objects that are either specific scenes, and then they are later tested for their memories with scene object association. And what these experimenters did was to look at the similarity between patterns of activity in the hippocampus elicited by objects that were paired with the same scene, as opposed to objects that were paired with different scenes. And they found that over time, objects paired with the same scenes became similar in their patterns of activity when they were remembered, and objects that were paired with difference. And the authors argue that because you get memory integration, it's apparently representations, which they never explain to us as are supposed to act. But these memory representations become integrated. Because they become integrated, you get similar treatment steps. So the point is, this is an fMRI experiment. fMRI can only tell us about active latent representations. And it is not hard to invent situations. This sort of result occurs without any need to propose any modification to the existing memory representations at all. So imagine that in this recent edition, each memory retrieval cube 100% and exclusively elicits its own activity from its own. But over time, these retrieval cubes become less specific. So they still predominantly activate their targeted memory representation. They also partially activate other memory representation. And when you look at patterns of blocks of activity, you'll get pretty similarity between them simply because of the mixing. Nothing has happened to the angle. All that's happened is that the cue is less specific and is co-activating. There is no reason on earth to think this is an explanation. So there's no need to think that this is what's happened. What's happened is that these cues are becoming more promiscuous and are simply able to contact more representation target. So the fMRI data tell us anything about whether memories are applied into. So wrapping up very quickly. So these are the outstanding questions that come to us. No time at all to discuss them. Is the presence or the absence of causal connection the only difference? How strong does the causal connection between event and cognitive have to be representation? Presumably, the causal theory is great. No one has said how strong does that causal relationship have to be. Does any relationship, or is there some criteria level of causal strength? Can multiple engrams represent the same? If you're Lynn and Morris, absolutely. We don't think there's much evidence to tell us that. Can the causal framework be applied to semantic? In our paper, we tried to do that, very unsuccessfully. But it's an interesting question. Can it be applied to implicitly? how malleable hippocampal, according to Lyman here, not very. And much of the evidence that's been taken as evidence for engram modification is either empirically questioned or can be explained by alternative things. And how does the causal framework consolidate? Are there even such things? I would want to argue that memories that are represented in a consolidated form, neocortex, probably don't count as episodic memories in the way that, say, Endlich Holding want to define an episodic. They've become semanticized, and they're better thought of as some kind of semantic memory representation rather than a truly episodic representation. So those are the outstanding questions. Can we identify latent representations? There is an interesting paper in Science that argues that we can. So in this paper, they use diffusion imaging to show that the repeated retrieval of a memory that was originally hippocampally dependent leads to a relatively persistent change in the diffusion properties of humans, which is the region which where retrieval-related activity is seen as it drops out of the campus, repeated study test cycles. So it is possible that we can perhaps find some way of looking at these physical changes in the brain that may encode an experience. In this case, it took repeated retrieval attempts to get this to happen, something like 6. It's not single shot, so it's not what I mean. But it's very intriguing to think that some non-invasive method of diffusion energy may be able to pick up changes in structural brain changes that have some relevance to a memory latent. So, thank you.
I recognize that people time constraints. This would be that tweet for free, but we're happy to take a few questions. Start at the back.
So I apologize for I'm not going to as well, but my sleep is right. Fortunately, that's way different. So if you have thoughts on that broadly, like so like sleep are
I think those are the answer is people. No one thinks that the masses. No one thinks that the campus is going to be exactly the same thing. Seems unlikely. However, to the best of my knowledge, there's no on it. Patients that sort of happens to the pattern next you see absent perhaps so far little evidence. But then you look at engram cells.
does the I guess are there lots of research that assume that scaling and is there some question about what's actually
No, there's no question that what gets encoded is more complex to design cortex, isn't it? But that doesn't mean to say that the campus is different. Everything that's come out of the engram cell research is embarrassingly consistent with the dogma. That is, it's listening to patterns of activity. So the engram cell literature shows you that hippocampus is not the be all potential theory. Perhaps the engram itself is distributed across huge areas. I didn't show the picture for very long. So, good. That is a flat map of a mouse brain, and all those colored dots are engram cells. They're cells which are active at the time that the mouse is experiencing the event, and which are also active when the mouse retrieves it. And just like in humans, reinstatement is a cortex-wide phenomenon. It's not only in the hippocampus. However, if you lesion the hippocampus of the mouse shortly after a contextual fear conditioning episode, it has very poor memory for the event. So it seems very, very similar to what we see in humans. Now, that doesn't, is this memory as rich and as complex and as multidimensional as it would be in a primate or a human? No. The fundamental mechanics don't seem to.
So let's check online and we can come back to in person. Is there any questions online?
Yes, we have one question online. I'm going to go ahead and read it. Given recent evidence that future episodic thinking network activity varies in relation to the plausibility of imagined scenarios, for example, posterior to anterior, hippocampal shift, etc., do we see any analogous variations in activity during episodic memory retrieval? For example, variations based on the extent of reliance on semantics during memory reconstruction?
It's a very good question. The answer is yes, and in particular, even in the retrieval of episodic memories themselves, there is some evidence to suggest that the specificity or the level of detail of the memory relates to patterns of activity along the longitudinal axis of the hippocampus. So it has been suggested, I don't personally think the evidence is as great as it's sometimes put out to be, that the more general the memory, the less specific the memory, the more anterior is the activity within the hippocampus. So you have this gradient from fine-grained to more coarse-grained memories within the hippocampus. And that was motivated by evidence that place cells, place fields in the rat hippocampus are smaller in the posterior. In the rat, it would be the dorsal hippocampus than the ventral hippocampus, posterior to anterior. But yes, you could definitely show more or less concomitant activity in other neocortical regions, depending upon the amount of elaboration that goes on, either at encoding or retrieval. Yeah.
More questions from the in-person audience?
Yeah, Jen.
What do you think would be, and first of all, thanks for a good talk. What do you think would be an excellent and successful single design test of the part? The fact that it's recalling more than one memory in one single design. So, for example, that it's recalling one of the, in rats, with the extinction, that there's some traces. How would you test that out in humans to get separate contextual specific details?
I think you could possibly do the analogous experiments that have been done in rodents, but I'm on my feet. I can't think of a relevant study right now. I have to think about that. But if the question is, can you retrieve more than one memory at the same time, you can certainly hold in your mind more than one active representation, as long as you're switching attention. It's just working memory. So once information comes back and becomes an active memory representation, that's essentially, there's a whole theory about the so-called episodic buffer, which is a part of, this is Alan Baddeley's idea, that one of the component processes of working memory is something called an episodic buffer. And the idea is that holds on to episodic information that you've retrieved, probably for a time scale of at least 30 seconds or so. So there would be no reason in principle why you couldn't hold two episodic memory representations in mind at the same time, just like you can hold two working memory representations in memory at the same time. We've tried to come up with experiments to do that, actually, without much success. But the idea would be that people probably have to switch between them, just the same as in working memory. What seems like simultaneous memory for multiple events is not. It's very rapid attentional switching between one event and then another event. And the capacity limits of working memory are met when you can't switch your attention fast enough. So the information gets degraded before you can come back to it. But in principle, I don't see any reason why that shouldn't be possible. As I said, I half wrote a grant that was entirely about retrieving multiple episodic memories and then holding them in mind and integrating across them to solve the memory task. Brilliant idea. Just couldn't make it work from an experimental design point of view. Still think it's a good idea. If anyone has a good way of doing that experimentally, let me know and I'll finish the grant. But it's a good question. Yes.
So, thinking about the distinction you made between remembering or recollection and imagination, as a function of the causality of events leading to remembering, necessitating causal sequence of events.
Yeah.
As I know, the arguments behind imagination have been that these are a product of a reconstructive nature of memory. Without that, you won't be able to imagine, simulate future events and so forth.
Yes.
So at a certain level, you need to have a memory or
absolutely
in place to build that imagination.
So that is the obvious explanation, and it's the one that Dan originally had.
Right.
That episodic future thought involves retrieving episodic memories and then recasting or repurposing those memories to come up with a potential episodic future representation, in which case it's trivial that you see an overlap, because in both cases you have to retrieve memories. If you read Donna Addis's most recent writing, she rejects that flat out. That is not what is going on. What is going on when you retrieve information or when you imagine it is a simulation. And so the reason the same network is activated is not because you need your memory to imagine the future. It's because in both cases you're generating a simulated mental representation of a simulated scenario. And the only difference between the future and the past is that in some magical way, which is never explained, simulation of the past is veridical when it is guided by some kind of memory. There's never any explanation for how that happens. It's incredibly frustrating to read the simulationist philosophers talking about this, and including Philippe de Brigard, who also takes this view, because it's like magic.
Yeah.
It's like guided imagination. It just happens to correspond to the past. But even if it didn't correspond to the past, it's still a legitimate memory. That is their argument. Because memory is simply simulate past-oriented imagination. That is literally a quote.
Yeah. It almost feel like there's a threshold at which something, are they arguing there's a threshold between which something's a memory?
It seems like once it's defined that way, it's that.
Yeah, no, I know.
And
But it has important implications, I think. I don't buy that. I'm perfectly happy to think that when I think about what am I going to do on holiday next year, I do that by remembering what I did on holiday last year. I have no problem with that. And Eleanor Maguire, by the way, also rejects out of hand the idea that future episodic thought is based on past memories. She wants to argue that everything is scene construction. Everything. And for her, the hippocampus is as important for constructing an imaginary scene as it is for remembering a veridical event. Not because the hippocampus stores anything, but because the hippocampus is crucial computational machinery for the construction of these representations.
Yeah.
So not everyone
Irrespective
that.
of whether or not it's even a real event.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah,
For her,
yeah.
for Eleanor, she has much more in common with Donna and with the Strasbourg School of Philosophy, which is where this non-causal idea comes from, than she does with someone like myself, who's much more in the kind of Ebbinghaus school, I guess you'd call it, the correspondence school. Yeah.
So thinking more about this idea of the interplay between, episodic memory and schemas. We're going to do some experiments, say, evaluate memory with different reliance on schemas.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
My birthday this year versus my birthday
Yeah.
15 years ago.
So there's a massive literature on that, looking at schema congruent versus schema incongruent events, how they get encoded and how they get retrieved.
I'm not thinking about incongruent necessarily, but just something that is fresh in my mind versus something that I do have to rely on.
I see.
What is the birthday like?
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah. So that would be particularly relevant to the autobiographical memory literature, where people absolutely, as memories become vague and become less detailed, then to get a full representation of that, declarative representation of that memory, you absolutely have to rely more on non-episodic. So this is the question: how much can you rely on episodic memory and still claim to be remembered?
Yes, so my question is, if you look at that core network activation as you're relying on this more heavily on the schema.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether anyone has done that systematically. It's a very good question. It'd be a very interesting experiment to do. I don't know that anyone has systematically developed. It's a very good suggestion. You can predict that eventually there'll be.
Okay, I'm sure for those who have additional questions, I could be happy to yes. Visit him next door to here, actually. Please join me in